after many questions, I've been asked to do these undisguised now, so I don't give a shit. So it's undisguised. Subscribe to this YouTube channel and stuff. I hope you can fucking understand them now, because people are moaning.
Hello, my name's Will. I'm a real werewolf. If you've listened to the other videos, podcasts, whatever they may be that I've offered before, I've been talking about the fact that I was captured by special forces in Kosovo, and then I was tortured and shit, and I met the head of the special forces, a guy that I didn't know the name of, called Chief and stuff. But now actually we're getting to a point where I just had to allow myself to get I had to give myself up really and offer myself over, because I couldn't find no way out. So yeah, I was a werewolf and they were going to offer me work apparently. It was either that or they were going to kill me. So, you know, I knew at some point I'd be able to get out of it, but it was just a case of, you know, having to take what I needed to take at the time. So I'm going to take you through what happened to me and stuff, and how the offer of work came about. So I've written this down because it's a long story. So if it sounds like I'm reading out of a piece of paper, then it's because I'm reading off a piece of paper. But I'm trying to make it a bit better. Okay, it's all right. So eventually I agreed to work for them, and now I had to go and get interviewed, as it were, by like lots of top brass. So this is that story. Okay. So after I agreed, over the next few days, the room that I was in, the room that I was in a cell with, became full of people, and they all asked questions, and they all had questions to ask, and compromises to offer. Agreements were raised and drafted. The powers that be were willing to take a chance. They were willing to see if I could follow the rules that they're set. I'd agreed to so many constraints. Now was in the day in which I would sample my freedom once more. I would be allowed to escape my cage. I know it was a test. It was always a test in those early days. The cell that I was locked in was a very small cell. It was like 1.5 meters cubed. It was so tough, and it was welded closed. I mean, I had a bucket and a blanket. That was it. Yeah, and I'd been in there for what felt like months. It was probably days, but it felt like months. So I knew that the full moon was coming up. I was going to become a werewolf, and I would not be able to be in a 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 box. It would just be, let's say, rather uncomfortable. So I kind of had to agree to do this. I'd spoken to my posit. My posit is my werewolf soul. He's a separate entity to me. He follows me about. When we combine, we become a werewolf. Again, if you listen to the past interviews, you'll hear about that. Okay. So yeah, they were going to let me out of this horrible little cell. So the welder came into the room with soldiers. I was asked to sit at the back of my little home, this little cell, and they gave me this really thick fireproof like blanket to mask my body as he started to eat the weld away with his whatever it is, so I could get out of the box. The metal was cut and the side of the cage clanged to the floor. I instantly had the man's hand in my throat. Literally, time did not exist. I had his hand in my throat, and the soldiers that had come in with him didn't even have a time to react. So I just held him up as a trophy at arm's length. Now he panicked as he kind of reached pathetically for my hand, and he was choking a little bit. I wasn't going to kill him. I was just showing them how quick I was. The weapons in the room eventually caught up with my movement and were pointed in my direction. The smell of fear was refreshing after being this powerless little prisoner for so long. You know, at that time I could have absorbed my werewolf and I could have just fucking ripped them apart. But I knew I probably wouldn't escape from the room. The soldiers had no idea what to do as they dangled my dying victim there. Many of them had aimed in my direction, but none had pulled the trigger. The chief, the guy that I was telling you about, the boss of all these people, please go back to interview 2. That's where you get an introduction to him. The chief looked at me smiling. He took off his army cloth cap and began to fiddle with it in his hands. He was a little bit nervous, which is unlike the chief. And then he asked me, "What's the move, Will? The doors are sealed to this room. Even if you cannot get out of here, even if you kill everyone, you would also be trapped. Also, this place is rigged to burn you up. Is that what you want? Let him go. Otherwise, I will let these guys fire on you, and although it may not kill you, it will inconvenience you for a while." He nodded. He was waiting for my next move. I lowered the choking man down, his welder's mask dropping on the floor behind him. He managed to maintain his standing position as his feet touched the floor, and then when I felt he could stand up, I just let go of him. I smiled at the crowd around and made a big deal of dusting the panicking man down. I was just brushing him down with my hand, and he just stood there terrified and shaking. The torch he had in his hand was still lit. I shrugged and I spoke to them. I said, "See, I'm playing, no harm is done, he's fine." And I put my hands up above my head, raising my hands in supplication. The room sighed in relief, and it was as though a weight was lifted off each man's shoulders. They thought I was having my last hurrah before my submission. They were almost relaxed. The chief had tamed me right in front of their eyes. But then I was stood behind a soldier at the back of the group. I'd swept his legs from under him and had one foot on his chest, his gun out of his arms, and now pointed at the chief. It was great. It happened so quick. The men had no time to react. I laughed and then folded the muzzle of the weapon with my hands. And then I thought it was a joke. "See, it can now shoot round corners," I told them, and smiled. "Okay, what is the next step?" I asked. "You can see that I am trustworthy. If I was not, all of you would be," I started, but the chief continued to talk over me, which was a bit rude and discourteous. But to be honest, he was running the show. And he continued from his last conversation, "And there's a large number of explosives below you," he continued, "and then gallons of napalm that are in large tanks above the ceiling. And when those explosions below go off, then that ceiling would collapse. So that napalm would also be all over you. I think several kilos of C4 and thousands of gallons of burning napalm would have been a difficult situation even for you to survive. This room would very quickly become the same temperature as the surface of the sun. There would not be any bit of evidence that you had even existed." And then he stopped and smiled. As I removed the cap from the nearest soldier and just gently kissed him on the forehead. The poor soldier was perplexed, and he really had no idea of how to respond to this action, but I simply smiled and winked at him, mouthing, "You're next." And that was unseen to anybody else, and his eyes were just full of fear. I then turned and faced my audience of raised weaponry and took a theatrical bow and raised my hands briefly, dropping them, and shrugged. "Well done, you passed," said the chief, smiling. "Well, you passed one of many tests. The rest of your life is going to be one test after another. You're a lucky bastard." I lifted my hands, put them behind the back of my head, and sunk to my knees. It was really funny. Automatically, the guards moved slowly towards me to subdue and restrain me. One of them even went to cuff my hands while desperately trying not to meet my eyes. "Whoa!" exclaimed the chief. "Do you think that would be worth doing, Captain? Do you think that those cuffs will hold him?" The captain, in response, looked down at the cuffs in embarrassment and shuffled away from me sideways, apologising. Eventually, heart rate settled in the room. I was invited to leave the room very politely and taken to a new cell in the same building. This one had a very thin cot bed. The walls were plain concrete, unfinished, and still dusty from a recent construction or lack of use of the room, one or the other. The floor was slate, but had nice underfloor heating. There were no windows, just several small air vents. Spotlights were recessed into the ceiling, and it gave it its own washed-out light. It was a step up from the cage in the middle of a fucking huge room, but it was still a cell of sorts. The chief said that they would not lock the door. They trusted me. Rightio, I thought, being certain that they would. They were not stupid enough. I hoped to let me have free reign of the building. I think they wanted me to have free reign of the building. Also, with all the CCTV coverage of the room, meant that if I left, it would be impossible for me to get out without everyone noticing. It felt that this whole thing had been built and organised for me yet again. I was special. It made me feel good. Just like everyone in the past had said, I was special. This room was different, though. It seemed that I would be able to escape this room easily. It seemed that it was way too easy. So that meant it would be some kind of double bluff. Again, it was a test to try me, to see if I would listen to them or not. A test to see if I would try and break out of this place. The room was obviously booby-trapped to stop me escaping. I could smell the solvents that would burn me. I could not locate where the accelerants were stored, and to be honest, even if I knew where they were, what could I do? But this whole thing was too exciting at the moment to find out, why. So I wanted to see how this story would play. Food and water arrived regularly, and there was a proper toilet and toilet paper and everything. amazing. I could even have a shower. The next morning, the chief came to my door and asked me to follow him. He was by himself, no other soldiers, which was a bit strange and trusting. I was so close to fucking him up right there. I wanted desperately to imbibe Fen and start a killing spree, but something held me back. Fen's my posit, as I said before, my wolf soul. Once he comes into me, that's when the doggy comes out. The chief was very calm and walked ahead of me completely relaxed and showing no fear of me at all. I could sense nothing from him, no discomfort or stress. There was nothing in the man's demeanour. It was strange how confident he was. He knew I would have killed him at a whim. He knew it, but was content. It was weird and made me anxious in my turn. Eventually we entered into another vast room, much like the one I'd been in the beginning. It was not the same room that I'd been in, not my original cell, but it was very similar. The smells were different. This room had lots of crappy plastic chairs sat in lines on which an audience could be seated. All of them were facing a raised platform where a large steel cage sat. The cell was larger than my original, and inside the steel barred cube was a chair, probably fixed to the floor, a table, a large bottle of water and a cup. All the liquid containers were plastic with no deadly glass. Who knows what damage could be done with a bit of glass? I mean, in comparison to the damage that a giant werewolf could do. Hanging from the top of the cage was a microphone. The cage had cameras and other media type equipment surrounding it, ready to record whatever was going to happen during this display. There were several techie types in one corner and a lot of soldiers with various tools of their craft. Rifles, machine guns, flamethrowers and hand grenades. Why would they have fucking hand grenades in a room full of people? Then I realised they were that scared of me that they would use them if necessary. This made me feel quite proud to feel that they felt extremely threatened by my simple presence. Smiling, the chief turned to me as we walked down the gap between the chairs. As we got towards the cage, he opened his arms to the scene and said, "This is all for you and Fenrir." As we arrived at the front row, he stepped to one side and motioned me towards the door of the cell. I nodded my head at this invitation and stepped up into the platform and entered the cage and turned and sat in the steel chair. The chair that was most definitely bolted very solidly to the floor of the cage. The chief smiled his gratitude and reached forward as he clanged the door closed, locking it with a sweep of his palm over some screen thing. Must have been like fingerprint recognition or some shit like that. I just needed his hand then to get out. He then pressed his finger to his ear and said, "All is as safe as it's going to be. Bring in the bigwigs." After a while, the doors opened at the back of the room and some suits and uniforms walked in. There were a number of little groups consisting of senior figures surrounded by their respective entourages. It was somewhat amusing to watch the VIPs like ships surrounded by small busy flotillas of tugs, directing them into their respective dry dock seating. There were 10 bigwigs in total, and they wore plain army fatigues to hide their identities for some unknown and, to be honest, uncared for reason. Maybe it was not for my privilege, who knows. It was apparent that each party was trying its best to pretend the others in the room did not exist, and they were not comfy dressed like this, with no ranks or insignia to display their importance to others with them. They took their time to sit in silence and once ready began to look at me. I mean really look at me as though seeing a person for the first time. Many different thoughts were going on in those heads. Some were incredulous, some were frightened, some were bored and uncaring. Most looked at me as though I was going to explode or something. Not necessarily scared, but they were nervous. The chief had his back to me and stood with his arms crossed. He nodded to a few of the people as they sat down, and they returned an acknowledgement to him. Once they had got themselves comfy, the chief stepped forward and was ready to address his audience. It was time for the show to begin, and the show was me. Pure and unadulterated little me. So the chief began. "Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are introducing you to this man." He paused and in silence turned and pointed at me with a high level of dramatic effect. "This is Will the Beast. Yes, that is his real name. He, ladies and gentlemen, is a werewolf and an all-round evil son of a bitch." He turned to me. No offence about the bitch part, Will. "As you have read in the reports that have been sent to your respective offices, we managed to capture him just after he had committed an act of his own personal type of genocide on a small village in the Baltic regions. He may look like a kind and gentle fellow, but let me tell you that he is one of the most psychotic and brutal killers I have ever had the pleasure to meet. He is a cannibal and child killer, and he's personally dispatched untold numbers of people into the next world with his own hands, or claws, or teeth, or whatever. So make no mistake, He is a consummate liar and a narcissist of the highest order. He is incredibly charismatic and the most dangerous living thing to strike the Western world since smallpox, or even maybe Hitler. Laughs came from the crowd. Please don't take him lightly. He has already remembered your face and your smell and whatever else his senses tell him, and will probably in the future want to kill you for this humiliation. I know he wants to kill me. At this point he paused once more and turned and smiled. I nodded in agreement with his last statement, and he nodded back and turned back to the audience, smiling. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, please show him the utmost respect as a favour to me. I believe that he sits in that cage for no other reason than he is intrigued as to what is happening, and that if he wanted to break free, that he could do so very easily. Although I'm not so sure about that, and maybe I am giving the man much more respect than he is due. In the event of a breach, you have all agreed to the building being sealed and destroyed in a manner we think would be appropriate to destroy the threat. But I'm really hoping that this is not a necessary step to take. Again, he paused. We are assessing the chances that we can use him in operational situations. Here today we are offering him open to question and discussion by your respective divisions. He is a very bright fellow and seems like he wishes to become compliant at this stage, so without further ado, I will hand you over to Will. He turned to me and asked, "You okay with this?" I replied, "I am." This was not how I thought this would go at all. The chief nodded to me and made his way down off the platform. He took his time and dropped relieved into a seat near the front. He kept eye contact with me and nodded as though giving me approval or something. I smiled and nodded back. A woman stood up out of her seat. She had short blonde hair and blue eyes. She was not classically good looking, but had something about her that stood out as attractive. She looked good in her uniform and would normally be on my list of things to do. I turned to her and gave her a bright toothy smile. And this is what she said. "Okay, we have all seen the pictures and read all these here reports," she said, holding a folder and speaking in a South African accent. "But I still find it difficult to believe that there are actual real werewolves in the world. Why would we have never seen one before? So can we get some proof?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. There are werewolves," I replied. "Well, at least this one. Where do you think those legends come from? I thought you guys had captured aliens and all sorts of shit in your time. I've read the conspiracy theories that expound these things. Are they not true?" She ignored this, and she just said, "Well, can we have proof of what you are?" And she had asked me, and she was a little irritated. She obviously was used to people complying with her wishes straight away. So I sat and smiled and looked at her. "Don't you believe your intel, ma'am?" And then I smiled all coyly, batting my eyelids, all seductively-ish. "I would love to believe the intel, and she actually checked her folder. She didn't know my name. Will," she said. "I think all of us would like to see what an actual werewolf looks like." And then she smiled and paused and batted her eyelids right back at me. "If that's what you actually are. Not just some mentally deranged psychopath with some fantasy syndrome. I would also like to see it in the flesh, as it were. Is that a thing you can do, or do we have to wait for full moon?" she said, laughing. And then she turned to the other members of the audience, raising her hands. She was obviously getting very irritated now. Her body language was actually using exclamation marks. From the rest of the group, there were general noises of agreement, and they all started to ask for proof. I would probably need to put up or shut up. So I thought I was getting clever. I replied, "I suppose I'm like Taleb's black swan, an impossible outlier that cannot exist, although I am truly no black swan but the black dog. I suppose in this case I will have to prove myself. Maybe I don't want to, though. Maybe fuck you," I smiled and folded my arms in a teen-like huff. She laughed. "Well, it's your choice." She only had to look in a fucking folder again to check my name. "Bitch. Will," she said, "but then I will personally see to it that you will have a life. Well, that is to be very short. It will not even be measurable in dog years, and that's your choice." She sat down on a seat and crossed her legs. I sat reflecting on my next move, gently tapping my foot and thinking whether or not I should reveal myself. Should I put myself through this humiliating exhibition? Would my posit also allow it? I looked at the posit and shrugged. This was a very embarrassing situation. I felt powerless and not in a spot where I could refuse and probably live. I would do what they asked, but I would remember this and those faces. I would keep my anger to one side for a future moment of vengeance. Many would suffer for this. Well, at least that was what I thought at that point. My ego was bruised, and that is when a true beast gets dangerous. Physical injury was annoying, but putting a dent in my larger-than-life self-esteem meant war. Deposit sat up from his prone position. He yawned and scratched an ear lazily with his hind leg. He's just like a big dog. After some considerable time, he stood and padded his weary way to the front of the stage, where he came through the bars of the cell. He purposely took his time, and the gathered crowd were getting a little restless at my lack of movement. Eventually, Fenrir sat down in front of my chair and looked deep into my eyes. And telepathically, I heard, "I trust you will, you big knobhead. If you think that this is a good idea, then I'll do it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is the best option at this point." I could sense his unease, and he could sense my slight lack of confidence, a rare thing to happen. I leaned forward and smiled, looking deep into his eyes. I really wish I could go back to my childhood before we merged and be able to touch him. Before we merged, I could touch him, and it felt so good. And I told him, "We've no choice, my friend, so we must do this before we get a chance to kill them all. Kill them all in the most fucking heinous manner that we can." He nodded, and I continued to reassure him that I knew what I was doing. "Can we do that thing that I suggested with the needles, the cactus and the ostrich egg?" Fenrir asked. "Yes, Fen," I sent back, slightly confused but in agreement. "You haven't got a fucking clue what I'm talking about, have you, Will?" he replied. I shrugged again. "Not a fucking clue, Fenrir, but it sounds interesting." He laughed. We prepared to join our minds, ready for the change. I smiled once more at my posit and rose to my feet. The audience started to pay a deeper interest. I began to take my clothes off and fold them carefully and place them on the chair. I did this in a striptease with a burlesque rhythm playing in my mind, taking my time and noticing with my upgraded senses the effect that it had on those watching. To some of my audience, it was a disgusting display which seemed somewhat vulgar. To some, it was a tantalising pleasure. To all, it was an uncomfy experience in this particular setting, which meant I really liked it. If humiliating me was enjoyable for them, then the least I could do was to make them feel a little uncomfy in their skins. Once naked, I stood and faced the crowd, raising my hands as though I was one of those sad and slightly bad magicians on a Sunday afternoon TV. I stood there a little too long in silence, framing my flaccid but sizable penis with my hands. Oh, these people were becoming so uncomfortable. It was wonderful. "Ta-da!" I shouted with some flourish and exuberance, breaking the silence and getting an audible gasp from several of the group members. There again was another silence and a definite poignant pause, so I took this pause to absorb the posit. I took my werewolf form. My body was not racked with agony. It did not pass through the painful transformations in the films. No rolling on the floor in torment for me. No cracks of extending the bones or ripping of muscles and flesh. Just the pleasurable growth of my wolfen body. It was similar to getting a whole body erection. You really felt bigger and harder all over, and a little more vascular too. All the watchers had witnessed was a smooth and comfy transition into my doggy dude self. My sleek body first elongated, taking me to my new height. My musculature then enlarged beneath my skin, starting in my torso and slowly moving up and down my body. I grew in size and stature. My triple-jointed legs stretched beneath me as my snout elongated, ears and teeth became apparent. Finally, my pelt of darkness covered me, matte black darkness, engulfing the light. It felt like a blanket around me. Even in this stark and flickering fluorescent light, I became a dark shadow, sucking all the light out of the room and into my form. The outlined silhouette in front of them opened its eyes. They were like polished amber and shining with the very fires of the last ring of hell, the hell that I would send each of these humans to when I got a chance to touch them for a fucking moment. I posed before them, a god. All in the room realised they were seeing something beyond their respective power. They understood that my capture had not cowed me. They could not have forced me into this cell or this transformation, and that they now knew that I was here by my own fucking choice. That was utter bollocks, to be honest. This idea was not true. I was stuck, but I had been accused of being a narcissistic liar, so I'd live up to that label. Maybe I could convince them that I was enjoying this. It would only show these people that their future held. I knew I was a terrifying sight, and even stood in this cage the humans were disturbed, perturbed, and would have preferred to be anywhere but in this room. They were desperate to get away. The cameras that surrounded me whirred and purred as they moved and refocused on the tripod stands, and for the simple sake of the moment I let out a howl so deep and soulful that it stirred the very soul of each person in attendance, while it stirred their ape DNA and the shit in their bowels. There was silence now. No one moved, and no one dared break the quiet for some time. That was until it was all ruined by an audible single intake of breath. Following this, there were more gasps and a slight scream from a guy at the front of the room who tried and failed to gather himself together as his clipboard and pen bounced on the floor. And then again, silence. I stood surrounded by steel bars in front of this stunned audience. It felt good to let people actually see me for what I was. Their jaws had dropped in response, and just before the reality took a werewolf-sized bite, I thought in my mind, and that's not all, folks, and took my transformation further into my sexy motherfucking wolf form. In my wolf form, I am hugely intimidating. You would never mistake this shape as a large dog when in proximity. I stared through the bars with my new wolf-powered eyes at 40 or 50 faces as they tried to process what had just happened, yet again dumbfounded and silent. The chief harumphed in his seat, bringing everyone back into the here and the now. He slowly unfolded himself from the chair and casually walked towards the cage. He smiled at me and winked before he turned his back to me once more. He crossed his arms across his chest and, looking for words to try and express his thoughts, spoke to the audience. Well, I would like to thank Will for his wonderful demonstration. I think that we can all agree that it was a very unexpected thing to see. He stood silently. There was really nothing else to add to what had just happened and what they just experienced. The audience broke out into clapping as though it was some magic trick that I'd undertaken. He then turned back to face me. Would you mind returning to your man form for us? We can then ask you a few more questions. I shook my great wolfy head. I realised that he had not got a clue what this head shake meant, but he did say thanks in response. Things happened quickly after that. I was offered a contractor's position with the British government and their respective allies. As part of the agreement I made with the powers that be, they wanted me to undergo basic fucking military training and then on to selection for the Special Air Service. This would be the easy part of the deal for me. The hard bit would be the untraining of the wild wolf and the removal of all my unexpected nasty needs and wishes, and then the retraining of their new pet dog.